Poor Cowboy won an abandoned saloon for $3, found a woman hiding behind the bar. The deed was a piece of brown paper about the size of a playing card, folded twice, and it had a grease spot on one corner from somebody's thumb. I put it in my shirt pocket that night and didn't look at it again until morning. I was half afraid it would dissolve. The game had run 6 hours in the back of Tulsa Pratt's feed store, 4 men, a lantern on a nail, a bottle of rye that never got more than halfway down. I was playing with $3.11, which was what I had left after paying a week's board at Mrs. Hoffaker's rooming house, and I had made a promise to myself on the walkover that I would not lose more than 2 of those dollars. A man of 50 has to make that kind of promise to himself. Nobody else will make it for him. I broke it on the first bad hand, lost $1.40 in 2 deals, won back 90 cents, lost it again. By the 3rd hour I had 22 cents and was about to stand up and walk home and try to sleep, except that Decker Mays, the man with the deed in front of him, started talking. He talked the way some men drink, which is to say compulsively and without pleasure. Said the Hargrove Saloon had been sitting empty 11 months. Said his brother had left it to him in a will, and that he couldn't sell it because there was a lien against the property from a hardware concern in Abilene. Said he was tired of paying the county taxes on a building he couldn't use and wouldn't visit, because Hargrove itself was 2 days east and not worth the ride. I knew about that saloon. Everybody in the territory knew about it or said they did. One of those places that becomes a story before the dust has settled. Old man Hargrove had built it wrong, people said, too far from the stage road, too close to the river, too something. He died in it alone on a Tuesday in November and nobody had found him for 3 weeks. That was the story. Whether it was true I couldn't say. Decker Mays put the deed on the table the way you'd put down a card you didn't want, pushed it to the center. Said he'd take $3 for the deed and consider the building a charitable donation to whoever was fool enough to want it. I had 22 cents. The man to my left, a drover named Cass, big quiet man I'd known from a cattle run 3 years back, he looked at me, didn't say anything, just looked the way a man looks when he's trying to decide whether to lend you something. I looked back. He reached into his vest and set $2.78 on the felt in front of me. I didn't say thank you. Cass wouldn't have wanted that. I pushed the $3 to the center of the table and picked up the deed and put it in my shirt pocket. Decker Mays said, "Lord help you." I said, "Much obliged." That was it. Nobody shook hands. The lantern smelled like burnt wool, and one of the other men dealt a new hand, and I walked out into the October night with a grease-stained deed in my pocket and a building somewhere to the east that I had never seen and very likely couldn't sell. I didn't go to Hargrove right away. I didn't go for 2 weeks, which tells you something about what I expected to find. I went on owing Cass Devereaux $2.78, which I paid back out of a short stretch of post-hole work for a rancher named Pickett, who I'd contracted with before the card game. Hard work, dull work, 2 weeks of frost-hard ground and Pickett watching from on top of his horse like I might steal a shovel if he looked away. But the money was fair, and I paid Cass the full amount and $1 over for the loan, which he tried to refuse, and which I made him take because there is no other way to live. Cass asked me, the night I paid him, what I was going to do with the saloon. I said I didn't know yet. He said, "You going to sell it?" I said, "Who'd buy it? The lien's still on it." He said, "You going to run it?" I said, "I've never run a saloon." He looked at me with that look he had, not skeptical exactly, more the look of a man reading a hand before he says what he thinks of it. Said, "You've run cattle for other men your whole life. You know how to manage a thing. A saloon's got a herd, same as any spread. You just count it in dollars and bottles instead of head." I said, "That's a generous reading of my qualifications." He said, "You're the most capable man I know who's consistently gone his whole life without a stake. Seemed to me the only thing missing was the stake. Now you've got one." I thought about that for a few days while I was digging holes for Pickett and watching the frost come up in the mornings and listening to Pickett's horse breathe behind me. The most capable man I know who's consistently gone his whole life without a stake. That's a hard thing for a friend to say, but it's harder when it's accurate. You spend 30 years being competent in the service of other men's enterprises, and at some point, you have to ask whether that competence was the problem or whether the opportunity was. The morning I left for Hargrove, I had $11, my saddle, my horse Rufus, my bedroll, a canvas satchel with 3 days of food, and a Henry rifle I'd had for 12 years. The rifle was worth more than the saloon, probably. Rufus was worth more than the rifle. I was the least valuable thing on that road. 2 days' ride, as Decker Mays had said. The first day was flat and cold, good traveling weather if you don't mind the wind, which I don't. I've ridden in worse. The second day the road bent south toward the river and the country changed. Cottonwoods, low clay banks, stretches where the ground was soft and Rufus picked his way carefully. I came into Hargrove just before noon on a Wednesday. It was a small town. Not quite dead, but not flourishing either, maybe 200 people, a general store, a livery, a church that needed paint, 2 blocks of storefronts of which maybe half were occupied. A water tower with a crack in it that somebody had patched with tin. The kind of town that had hoped to be something and had settled for surviving. The saloon was at the far end of the main street, past the last occupied building by about 100 yards, which explained something about its commercial failure. A 2-story frame building, unpainted, the wood gone gray from weather. A covered porch across the front with one of the support posts leaning at an angle it shouldn't have been. The sign above the door said HARGROVE in letters that had once been painted red and were now the color of old brick. I tied Rufus at the porch rail and stood looking at it for a minute. A man in a canvas coat going past on the boardwalk across the street slowed down and watched me. I said, "Morning." He said, "You buying that place or just looking?" I said, "I own it, I believe." He said, and kept walking. I had the key from the deed, a single iron key on a loop of wire. I tried it in the front door lock and it stuck, then turned with more effort than I expected, the mechanism grinding like something was broken inside it. The door swung in. The smell hit me first. Dust and something under the dust, old wood, old liquor, mouse droppings, and something else I couldn't name, sweet and faintly wrong. The light came in pale through the 2 front windows, which were filmed with a year's worth of grime. 11 months empty. You could feel it. Not a haunted feeling, I don't hold with that, but the particular weight of a room nobody has warmed with their body heat for a long time. Tables still there. Chairs stacked on 2 of them, knocked over beside another, like someone had left in a hurry or never bothered to stack them at all. The bar itself running along the left wall, long, heavy, dark wood, a cracked mirror behind it, bottles still on the shelf, empty. The floor had a coating of grit that crunched underfoot. I walked to the bar and put both hands on it and looked at the room. Thought about what Decker Mays had said. Thought about old Hargrove dying in here on a Tuesday in November. And then something moved. Behind the bar. Low, quick, the shift of something trying not to make a sound and not quite managing it. I had my hand on the Henry before I knew I'd moved, not pulling it, just touching the stock, standing still. I said, "I can hear you." "Nothing." I said, "I'm not going to hurt you, but I'm going to need you to come out from there." A long pause. Then slowly, a woman stood up from behind the bar. She was maybe 35, though she might have been younger and just worn by circumstance. Dark hair loose around her shoulders, uncombed. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt too big for her and trousers and boots that were cracked at the toe. She had both hands visible and she was holding a short-handled kitchen knife, blade down, the way someone holds a knife when they mean it for defense but haven't decided yet. Her eyes were steady. That was the first thing I noticed. Not frightened or frightened, but not letting it run her. Watching me the way you watch something dangerous that hasn't moved yet. I took my hand off the rifle, held both of mine where she could see them. I said, "I'm the new owner. As of about 3 weeks ago, just arrived." She didn't say anything. I said, "You've been here the whole 11 months. She said, 7 weeks. I said, "There's mice in here." She said, "I know, I've been dealing with them." Her voice was even. Not from the territory originally, something in the shape of her words, some other part of the country. And she was hungry. You could see it in her face, not starved, but lean past where lean is healthy, and there was a tension in her that wasn't just the knife and the stranger. I said, "My name is Harlan Bryce. You want to put that knife on the bar." She thought about it, then she reached up and set it on the bar top, within reach, not away from her. "Message received," she said, "Clara Veitch." I said, "Miss Veitch. You hungry?" She looked at me, said, "What kind of question is that?" I said, the kind where I have salt, pork, and biscuits in my saddlebag, and I'm asking if you'd like some. She didn't answer right away, like the offer had to be evaluated from every angle for hidden trouble before she could accept it. Then she said, yes. I brought the food in and I made a small fire in the stove behind the bar, which took some doing because the flue was partially blocked, and the first attempt filled the room with smoke, and we had to open the front door and let it clear. She watched me work without offering to help and without commenting, just watched, not hostile, just waiting to see what kind of man I was. I understood that. After a while, I got the flue clear enough and the fire going, and I put the pork and biscuits in an iron pan. I found hanging on a nail, and she ate standing up, leaning against the far end of the bar, still watching. I ate too. We didn't talk. The fire in the stove put some warmth into the room, and after a while the feeling of the place shifted slightly, or I imagined it did. After she'd eaten, she said, "You really own it." I said, "I've got a deed," whether that's the same thing is a philosophical question. She said, "There's a lien from a hardware store in Abilene." I said, "Decker Mays told me." She said, "He told you, but you bought it anyway." I said, "For $3 I figured I could afford the question." She looked at me, said, "What are you going to do with it?" And there it was, the question I hadn't answered in 2 weeks of post-hole work and 2 days of writing. I said, "I'm going to figure that out." She was quiet a moment, then she said, "I'll be gone in a few days." I said, "Where to?" She didn't answer, went back to looking at the fire through the stove grate. I didn't push. You learn if you're paying attention when a question will land right and when it will close a door that might otherwise open on its own time. I said, "There's room to sleep upstairs, I expect. I haven't looked yet." She said, "There are 2 rooms. The small one at the back is less drafty." I said, "You took it." She said, "Yes." I said, "Keep it." She looked at me again, that same evaluating look. I had the sense she was not a woman who had been given much that didn't come with a cost attached, and she was deciding what I was charging for this. I said, "No charge, Miss Veitch. I'm not that kind of man." She held the look for another moment, then she nodded once short and went upstairs. I slept in the large room wrapped in my bedroll on the floor, which was fine. I've slept on worse than old floorboards, and the stove still held enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold off. In the morning, I was awake before light, which is habit, and I lay there in the dark thinking about the building. Here is what I knew. The building was sound or sound enough. The frame hadn't settled badly. The roof, I'd found one area upstairs where rain had come in and warped the boards, but it wasn't catastrophic. The bar itself was good lumber, solid, hadn't been damaged. The mirror behind it was cracked, but cracked mirrors aren't tragedy. The stove worked when the flue was clear. The windows needed cleaning. The floor needed sweeping, then probably sanding. The porch needed that post reset. The sign could stay as it was or come down. The lien, that was the real question. I didn't know the number on it. If it was small, if the hardware concern in Abilene had already written it off their books, it might be settled for less than face value. Those things happened. And even with the lien, a working saloon in a town that had no saloon would turn money. Maybe not hand-over-fist money. But real money, honest money, the kind a man can see and account for. I'd never owned a thing in my life. Never a piece of land, never a building, never a horse I hadn't eventually had to sell. Rufus was the closest thing to a stake I had, and he was getting on. I was 50 years old, and I'd spent 30 of them working other men's cattle on other men's land and sleeping in other men's bunkhouses. It occurs to a man eventually that this is not how he imagined things would go. The deed was in my shirt pocket, still there, it hadn't dissolved. I got up before Clara came down, and I swept the front room from one end to the other, moving the furniture, getting into the corners, using a broom I found in a closet off the back hall. Filled a bucket with grit and mouse sign and old sawdust. Then I went outside and walked the exterior of the building in the early gray light, looking at the foundation, the joints, the roof pitch, the drainage around the base. The porch post was rotted at the base. I'd need to sister a new piece onto it or pull it and replace. The rest of the porch seemed solid. I found where a board on the south side had split and let in weather, and I marked it in my head. I was up on the porch roof, looking at the front parapet, when I heard the door open below me. Clara came out and looked up at me. She had a cup of something in her hand. She'd found coffee somewhere, or something that was serving as coffee. I said, "Morning." She said, "What are you doing up there?" I said, looking at what needs doing. She said, and? I said, the list is long, but it's not beyond fixing. I've got bigger problems. She said, the lien. I said, the lien. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, the hardware concern is Schieffer Brothers. The lien is for $260. Hargrove ordered lumber and hardware for a renovation he never finished, and when he died they filed the lien against the property. They've been trying to collect for 3 years. I looked down at her, said, how do you know that? She said, I listen to people in this town. I've had 7 weeks. I climbed down off the porch roof. She handed me the cup, actual coffee, not substitution, which meant she'd found a canister I hadn't, and I drank some. She didn't have another cup, so we shared it, passing it back and forth, which neither of us commented on. I said, $260. She said, give or take. I said, I've got $11. She said, I know, you told me. I said, I don't recall telling you. She said, you told me for $3 you could afford the question, and you told me the post-hole work paid the loan back plus $1 over. You do some arithmetic, you can figure out the range. I looked at her, said, you're a careful listener. She said, I've had to be. There it was again, the thing behind the thing she wasn't saying. I drank the last of the coffee and handed her back the cup. I said, $260. That's not unsurmountable if the place is running. She said, it's not running. I said, no, but it could be. She looked at the building, said, in this town. I said, this town's got no saloon. It's got 200 people and no saloon. You know what 200 people do on a Saturday night with no saloon? They drink at home and they wish they weren't. She was quiet. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the forerunner of one. She said, you've thought about this. I said, I've had $11 and a deed to think with. A man works with what he's got. The question of Clara Vaich resolved itself in stages, not all at once. That is the nature of trust. It doesn't arrive, it accumulates. Over the first few days I worked on the building and she kept to herself, going out in the mornings before I was fully underway and coming back in the early afternoon, moving quietly, not intrusive but not absent either. She started cooking in the evenings, not asking whether I wanted food, just making enough for 2 and putting it on the table. I ate it and didn't make a ceremony of it, and neither did she. On the 4th day, I came in from resetting the porch post to find her behind the bar with a rag and a bottle she'd found somewhere, cleaning the bar top. Not because I'd asked, just because it needed doing and she was there. I said, you're good with a rag. She said, I'm good with most things if somebody lets me use them. I said, this is your bar as much as mine right now. She didn't answer that, kept cleaning. On the 6th day, I came back from the general store. I'd been talking to the proprietor, a man named Oster, about what the town needed and didn't have. And when I came through the door, Clara was sitting at the table near the front window with a notebook open in front of her. She'd been writing in it, and she didn't close it when I came in, which I took as a good sign. I said, what's that? She said, numbers. I said, 4. She said, if you open this place properly, you need a license from the county, which costs $12. You need a stock of liquor, which at wholesale from the distributor in Caldwell runs about $80 for a reasonable starting inventory, rye, whiskey, some gin, a few cases of beer. You need a new mirror because that cracked one is going to drive people out faster than it draws them. Mirrors cost money. You need glasses, those shelves are bare. You need lamps, good ones, not these. She gestured at the smoke-stained lanterns, because men won't stay in a dim room if they can help it. And you need someone to work the bar who knows what they're doing. I stood and looked at her, said, where'd you get all that? She said, Oster at the general store has the county rate schedule tacked to his wall. The Caldwell distributor comes through twice a month, and I found the rate card in Hargrove's desk upstairs. The rest is common sense. I said, you used to work a bar. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, I used to own one. The room was quiet except for the wind outside pressing at the south wall. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her and said, tell me what happened to it. She looked at me for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and set it down. Said, my husband built it, Platte River Country, Nebraska. We ran it together for 6 years. He died 2 winters ago, fever. After that, his brother came in with a lawyer from Omaha and a piece of paper that said the business had been the husband's alone and the widow had no claim. They gave me 60 days. I said, and you took your 60 days and left. She said, I took 48 and left with what I could carry. The 60 days felt like a cage. I said, and you ended up here. She said, I ended up here. She looked down at the notebook, said, I've been trying to figure out where to go next. A woman alone can work a hotel, she can take in laundry, she can teach school if the town has need of one and doesn't ask too many questions about her past. But she can't walk into a bank and negotiate a business loan, and she can't stand behind a bar and be taken seriously without a frame around her. A husband, a brother, something. I said, a partner. She looked up. I said, the building is mine and the deed is mine, but I don't know how to run a saloon and you do. The license goes in my name and so does the lien negotiation, which is what you need. But the operation of this place, what to order, how to stock it, how to run the floor, that would be yours. Equal take from what's left after expenses. She said, you don't know me. I said, I know you've been in this building 7 weeks, and the only thing you took was the small room at the back, because it was less drafty. I know you've been cleaning the bar and running numbers in a notebook and cooking supper without being asked. I know you could have left this town 20 times, and you're still here. She said, I'm still here because I didn't have enough money to go anywhere. I said, then you've still got a reason to be here. She looked at me a long time, said, what do you get out of it? I said, I've got a building and a lien and $11. On my own, I've got nothing. With someone who knows how to run the thing, I've got a business. She was quiet, then she said, there are men in this town who won't like it, a woman behind a bar, a woman in partnership. I said, I know it. She said, what do you do when they push? I said, I've been pushing back at things since before you were born, Miss Veitch. I haven't always won, but I've never quit either, and those two things together tend to wear a man's opposition down eventually. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she picked up the notebook and opened it again and said, I figure we can approach Schieffer Brothers with $120 as a settlement offer. Liens on dead properties for 3 years, they've mostly written it off by now. They'll want face value. We offer $120 and settle for somewhere between that and $150. That leaves us enough from a loan, which is the conversation you need to have with the Hargrove County Bank, to cover the license, the stock, and the fixtures. We open in 6 weeks. I said 6 weeks. She said, if you can get the roof fixed in 2. I said, I can get the roof fixed in 2. She said, then 6 weeks. I said, all right. She said, all right. We went back to work. That was October. By November, the porch post was solid, the south board was patched, the roof was fixed. I hired a Hargrove man named Sutter to help me, and between the two of us, we did it in 11 days, not 2 weeks. And the inside of the building had been swept, scrubbed. The floor sanded in sections and treated with linseed oil, the bar top polished to where you could nearly see yourself in it. Clara found a mirror in a storage room behind the general store, old but uncracked, and Oster let us have it for $4 with the promise of buying our glassware from him at fair wholesale. I want to say something about those weeks before the opening, because there was something in them that I've thought about since, something about the nature of work when it's yours and you know it's yours. I'd done more physical labor than most men over 30 years, and I was good at it, and it had never felt like anything except what it was. You dig the post hole, you set the post, you tamp the earth back down, you move to the next one. The work existed, and you did it, and it was done. This was different. I'd be up on the roof with Sutter nailing down, flashing around the repaired section, and I'd look out over the street and see the building from above, the porch I'd fixed, the sign I hadn't yet pulled down, the windows Clara had cleaned from the inside, and something in my chest would do a thing I didn't have a ready name for. Proprietorship, maybe, or something simpler than that. The knowledge that the nails I was driving were going into my own building, that the water wouldn't come through the ceiling onto my own floor, that when the work was done, I would walk back down and into a room that was mine to walk into. 50 years old, and that was a new thing. Sutter, who was a practical man and not given to commentary, came up beside me one afternoon and looked out over the same view and said, "You know what this place needs." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Paint, the front at least. You put a coat of paint on the front, it looks like something." I said, "I'll put it on the list." He said, "It's a good building. Hargrove built solid, just built it wrong placed is all." I said, "It's right placed for what it's going to be." He said, "Yeah, He picked up his hammer, said, "The woman knows saloons." I said, "She does." He said, "Good thing," and went back to work. That was the extent of it, but I thought about it, the way Sutter had said it, matter of fact, no judgment in it. The woman knows saloons. Like it was just a fact, which it was. Like the arrangement made sense to him, which it did. The trip to Abilene I did alone, by stage, which took the better part of 3 days round trip. I found Schieffer Brothers on Commerce Street, a hardware business, actual hardware, run by a man named Werner Schieffer who was in his 50s, and had the look of a man who kept careful records and never forgot a dollar owed. I sat across from him in his office, and I put the deed on his desk, and I explained the situation plainly. The property had changed hands. The new owner intended to operate it as a going concern, and I was there to settle the lien on terms that would put cash in his hand immediately rather than another 3 years of waiting on a dead property. Werner Schieffer said the lien was $260. I said I was prepared to settle today for $125 cash. He said that was 48 cents on the dollar. I said that was correct, and that 48 cents today was worth more than 260 cents in 3 more years of nothing. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said 175. I said 140. He said 160. I said 150, and I put my hand out. He shook it. I took the settlement agreement back to Hargrove, and I walked into the county bank, and I put the deed with the cleared lien on the president's desk, and I asked for a loan of $250 to be repaid over 18 months at standard interest against the property as collateral. The bank president's name was Alderman, and he was the kind of man who liked to ask questions before answering, so I answered all of them. He asked about the operation plan, and I gave him Clara's numbers from the notebook, which I'd memorized. He asked about the revenue projections, and I gave him those too. He asked who would be running the bar. I said my business partner, Clara Veitch. She ran a saloon in Nebraska 6 years. She knows the trade. He said a woman partner. I said a woman who knows what she's doing and a man who can handle whatever else needs handling. In this town with no saloon will return a profit inside 60 days. Alderman looked at me. Then he said, "I'll give you 200. I said 250. He said 225. I said done. The first Saturday we opened was the last Saturday of November. Cold outside, frost on the windows, the sky the color of old pewter, breath visible on the porch. Clara had the place lit with 6 good lamps, and the stove going and the bar stocked with what the distributor had brought up from Caldwell, not everything on her list yet, but enough. The new mirror caught the lamplight and threw it back around the room, so the whole place felt warmer and larger than it was. She wore her own clothes that night, a dark skirt and a white blouse and her hair pinned up. I'd seen her in the flannel shirt and trousers for 6 weeks, and the change was something to notice. Not that she looked different exactly. She looked like herself, which was the thing. By 7 o'clock, there were 14 men in the room. By 8, there were 23. By 9, the noise of the place was something I had to lean in to talk over. I spent the evening at the near end of the bar, not working it. That was Clara's, but present. Not that there was any real trouble that first night. One man got louder than he needed to, the way men do on their 3rd drink when they're among others and testing the room. Clara said something to him, short and quiet, and he settled. Another man tried to leave without paying, and I was at the door before he got through it, and I didn't say anything, just stood there, and he went back to the bar and paid. Small things, but the kind of small things that, if you don't handle them clean, stack up into real things. After close, midnight, the last man out, the door bolted, Clara counted the register. She set the money on the bar in stacks, and we stood on opposite sides and looked at it. She said $47.80. I said first night. She said first night. I did the arithmetic in my head. 23 men at $2 average. Roughly right. She said, if we do half that on weekday evenings and full capacity on Saturdays, we pay back the loan in 14 months and we're in profit by spring. I said you were right. She said about the lamps. The room needed the lamps. I said I meant about all of it. She looked at me, said, you put up the building. I said you knew what to do with it. The lamps were burning low. She'd been cutting the wicks all night to save oil. The room smelled of wood smoke and tobacco, and something else, warm and settled, that I hadn't smelled in a room for a long time. I was tired in the good way, the way a man gets tired when the day has been full of something worth doing. She started turning down the lamps one by one. When she got to the last one at the far end, she stopped and said, without turning around, "Harlan." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I didn't know what kind of man you were when you walked in here. I want you to know I know now." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. She turned down the last lamp. December came, and then January, which was hard, blizzard weather, 2 weeks where the cold sat on the town like something with weight, and men were less inclined to cross town for a drink when the thermometer said 15 degrees. We stayed open. Clara made coffee and kept the stove high and charged a nickel for the coffee, which some men paid for just to sit inside something warm. Those 2 weeks didn't break us. They didn't even bruise us badly. I used the slow evenings those 2 weeks to work on the back end of the building, a room off the kitchen that could eventually serve as storage, though for the time being I was using it to stack the extra cases from the Caldwell distributor and to keep the winter supplies Oster had helped me put together in November. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, a side of salt pork, 2 hams. Clara had said, when I brought it all in, that she hadn't seen anybody lay in that kind of store since her father, who'd grown up in the lean years after the war and never quite believed the lean years were gone. I said, "They're never all the way gone." She said, "No, they're not." There was something between us in those slow winter evenings that I noticed without remarking on. We'd worked side by side since October, cleaned, renovated, negotiated, opened, run the place. And in all that time we'd been efficient with each other in the way that people are when the work is the thing. Not cold, but purposeful. Those slow January nights with nobody in the chairs and the cold outside making the building contract and tick in the walls, there was less to be purposeful about, and we talked differently. Not about the business. Just talked. She told me she'd learned to cook from her mother's sister because her mother hadn't been around long enough to teach her. Said it matter-of-factly, the way people say things they've made peace with. I told her I'd learned to cook from a cook on a cattle drive named Esperanza who'd come up from Sonora, and who made a stew that could keep a man working for 16 hours on a cold day, and who'd never told anyone his recipe, and had taken it with him when the drive was over. She said, "Did you ever try to make it yourself?" I said, "Several times, never quite right." She said, "Maybe you were missing an ingredient." I said, "Or maybe some things belong to the person who made them." She looked at me over the rim of her cup, said, "That's a philosophical thought for a man who clears flues and resets porch posts." I said, "A man can do both." She said, "Yes, he can." Oster at the general store started buying his own whiskey from our distributor at the rate we'd negotiated, because we'd gotten a better deal than he had alone, which was how partnerships with neighboring businesses sometimes worked. He told people we were fair and reliable. In a small town, that's advertising you can't buy. There was also the pastor, a man named Colquitt, who came in one Tuesday in January when the place was mostly empty and sat at the bar and ordered coffee and looked around for a while. He didn't say much and I didn't push him. After a while he said he'd heard the establishment was run fairly. I said we tried. He said the town had needed something like it for some time, not the drink itself, though men would drink regardless, but a place, a gathering place. He said there was a kind of community that built up around a table and a warm room that couldn't be built in a church. Because a church asked something of a man the moment he walked in, and some men needed a place that didn't ask anything first. I thought that was the most honest thing a preacher had ever said to me. He came back most Tuesdays after that. Clara made him his coffee without being asked because she'd noticed the pattern before I had, which was characteristic. There were men who didn't like Clara. I knew there would be. 2 of them in particular, brothers named Fitch, freighters who came through Hargrove about twice a month, who made a habit of saying things to her across the bar that weren't said for any reason except to say them, to see what she'd do. She handled them correctly the first 2 times, said nothing that gave them purchase, moved away, redirected. The 3rd time I was in the room, and one of them said something I won't repeat, and Clara's jaw set the way it did when she was holding something back, and I came off the stool I'd been sitting on. I said, "Fitch." The older brother turned. I was standing about 6 feet from him, not close enough to be in his space yet, and I said, "I'm only going to say this once, so you want to make sure you hear it. You're welcome here as long as you act right. The moment you can't manage that, you're not welcome at all, and I don't mean you'll be asked to leave politely. You understand what I'm telling you." He was a big man, not as old as me, probably, and broader through the shoulders. He looked me over. Men in that situation are doing a calculation you can sometimes see them doing, and what they're calculating is whether the other man means what he's saying. I meant it. There's a feeling that goes through a man in a moment like that, not fear, not anger either, something quieter and more certain than anger, the feeling of a line having been drawn that will not move regardless of what happens next. A man who spent 30 years on other men's property, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, keeping his head down and his opinions to himself. That man has something stored up. I didn't go looking for a reason to spend it, but I wasn't going to waste it either. I don't know what he saw in me exactly. Whatever it was enough. He said, "All right," flat, not friendly, but not testing it further, picked up his drink and went to a table. His brother hadn't said a word the whole time and didn't say one now. The room had gone quiet while I was standing there, and it came back to itself afterward, the way a room does, conversation resuming, glasses moving. Clara poured a drink for the man at the end of the bar who'd been waiting and said nothing and didn't look at me, which was correct. She didn't say anything that night. Next morning, I was on the porch with coffee when she came out and stood next to me looking at the street, and after a minute she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" I said, "Because it was mine to do. My place, my bar, my partner. Not because you couldn't handle it yourself." She said, "I could have handled it." I said, "I know you could." She said, "Then why?" I said, "Because I was there, and it was mine to do, and I wasn't going to stand behind the stool and watch. That's all." She was quiet for a minute. The street was still, early morning, a dog moving along the far boardwalk and a wagon somewhere in the distance, and the cold was clean and dry, the kind that doesn't reach through a coat if you stand right. She said, "Your partner?" I said, "That's what we are." She said, "That's what we are." She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We stood there until the coffee was gone, which took a while because neither of us was in a hurry to go back in, and then we went back in. February is when things shift, sometimes, without you noticing until they already have. I had been sleeping in the front room since October on my bedroll on the floor, which was comfortable enough once I put down a piece of canvas, and then less comfortable once the floor and I had been acquainted for 4 months. I'd have bought a cot, but the money was going to the loan payment, and then to stock, and then to whatever small repair had come up that week, and a cot felt like spending on myself when the business was the thing to spend on. One evening in the second week of February, I came in late. I'd spent the afternoon helping Sutter patch a section of the livery roof he'd been struggling with, which wasn't my job, but he'd helped me with the saloon roof, and I didn't keep careful account of favors given or owed. And I was stiff and tired, and I sat down in the chair by the stove to pull my boots off, and I fell asleep in the chair. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Clara had put a blanket over me. The stove was banked low, and the room was dark except for the coals. She was sitting at the end of the bar with a candle and the notebook, working on something, not looking at me. I watched her for a minute before she knew I was awake, the set of her shoulders, the way she moved the pencil, and I thought about what she'd said in October about the frame around a woman. A husband, a brother, something. I said, "Clara." She looked up. I said, "This isn't the right time to say this, probably, and you can tell me that and I'll accept it, but I want you to know I'm not in this for the partnership." She was quiet. The candle moved a little, some draft from somewhere. She said, "What are you in it for?" I said, "You." She looked at me for a long time, said, "Harlan, I'm not a woman who—" She stopped, started again, said, "I've had someone take something from me once already. I won't do that again." I said, "I'm not asking to take anything. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because you deserve to know the truth about the man you're in business with." She was quiet again. Then she said, "It's not the right time." I said, "I know." She said, "Don't stop being my partner." I said, "That's not something I'm capable of." She looked down at the notebook, said, "Go to sleep, Harlan." I said, "Good night, Clara." I didn't bring it up again. I meant what I said, not asking for anything, not waiting on her to change her mind. A man who says a true thing and then waits for a return isn't telling the truth. He's negotiating. I wasn't negotiating. I meant it plainly, and I put it down. March. The snow came in March instead of January, one big storm that filled the street to the porch rail and kept the whole town indoors for 4 days. We were closed because there was nobody to serve and nowhere to go, and during those 4 days, Clara and I talked more than we had in the 5 months combined. The first day of the storm we worked. There was always something. A hinge that needed resetting. A section of shelving behind the bar that had started to sag and wanted a new bracket. The quarterly accounts that Clara kept in a ledger she'd bought from Oster, and which she updated every Sunday with a thoroughness that would have impressed a railroad accountant. We worked in the same building, in the same room mostly, with the snow coming sideways past the windows, and neither of us said much except what was relevant to the task. There's a comfort in that kind of quiet with a person. Not every quiet is comfortable. This one was. The second day the accounts were done, and the hinge was done, and there was nothing that absolutely had to happen. And we sat at the table near the front window with coffee and the white outside, and we talked. She told me about her husband, Thomas Veitch. A quiet man, she said, good in his way, not passionate but solid, and the 6 years had been good years, ordinary years, which was what she'd wanted after the family she'd come from, which had been neither quiet nor good. She told me about the lawyer from Omaha and the brother-in-law and the 60 days. Not with anger, not anymore. She had moved through the anger somewhere between Nebraska and here, and what was left was something more like a clear-eyed accounting of how things had gone. She didn't ask for sympathy, and I didn't offer it. I listened, which is the thing a man can do that has the most value and costs him the least, if he can manage to actually do it and not just wait for his turn to talk. She asked me about myself. Not the way people ask to be polite, but actually wanted to know. And so I told her. 30 years of ranch work from Texas up to Montana and back, working other men's cattle. A life that had fed me and kept me busy, but that had left me at 50 with a horse and a rifle and a bedroll. And the peculiar hollowness that settles in a man when he looks back and can't find the year things were supposed to get better and realizes that year wasn't in the plans. Not in anyone's plans that I'd been shown. She said, "Were you ever close to something?" I said, "Close to what?" She said, "To something of your own, before this." I thought about it honestly, said once 10 years back. There was a ranch in the Cimarron country, small place. Owner wanted to sell. The price was within reach if I'd saved another 18 months. I drank some coffee, said, "I didn't save another 18 months. She said, "What happened?" I said, "A friend needed money. I had it. He paid me back most of it." She looked at me, said, "And the ranch?" I said, "Sold to someone else. That's how it goes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You gave your savings to a friend." I said, "It's not a remarkable thing." She said, "It's not unremarkable either." The snow was still coming. One of the lamps needed trimming, but I didn't get up to do it yet. She said, "What was his name, the friend?" I said, "Cass." She said, "The man who lent you the $2.78. I looked at her, said, "Yes." She said, "So you saved his stake once and he saved yours." I said, "That's about right." She said, "Do you know where he is now?" I said, "Last I heard, somewhere in the Panhandle. He's all right." She nodded. Outside, the snow had that particular silence to it, not the absence of sound, but a muffling of it, everything further away. She said, "But you're here." I said, "I'm here." She said, "You won a saloon with $3. I said, 2 of which were borrowed. She said, "And now you've got a lien in settlement, a bank loan in repayment, and a business that turned $47 its first night." I said, "And a partner who knew where the numbers were." She said, "You put up the frame." I said, "You knew what to put inside it." She looked at me. The lamp was between us on the table, and the storm outside was making the building breathe slightly, the walls flexing, the way a solid building does when the wind is serious, not a worrying flex, the flex of a building that has settled into itself and knows what it is. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said in February." I said, "You don't need to." She said, "I know I don't need to. I'm thinking about it because I want to." I waited. I'm reasonably good at waiting, 30 years of it in various forms. She said, "I'm not a woman who can be rushed, and I'm not a woman who will be told what to think or when to feel it. And I've been wrong about men before, including one I chose freely, so I am slower about it now than I used to be." I said, "That sounds reasonable." She said, "But I'm not interested, Harlan. That's what I want you to know." The lamp between us, the snow outside. I said, that's enough for me. She said, good. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, warming them, and looked at the window, the white beyond it, and said, tell me about Montana. What does it look like up there? I told her. I talked for probably an hour, the country up there, the way the mountains sit on the horizon a whole day's ride before you get to them, the particular blue of cold mornings, the rivers that run clear over stone all summer and go gray with snowmelt in the spring. She listened the way she did when she was actually listening, still, attentive, asking a question now, and then that showed she'd been following every word. After a while she said, I've never been further west than this. I said, there's more west if you want it. She said, maybe someday. I said, maybe so. We sat there another hour before either of us moved to do anything else. The storm outside was not letting up. The building held. By spring, the loan was ahead of schedule. By early April, I made the 5th payment, which with the extra from our better weeks brought us ahead by 2 payments. And Alderman at the bank said, when I came in, that the Hargrove Saloon was the best lending decision he'd made in 3 years. I said I'd pass that along to my partner. He said he supposed he'd have to get used to calling her that. I said, yes, sir. You will. He shook my hand, which he hadn't done the day I walked in asking for $250, and which I noticed. The town had settled around us by then in the way towns settle around things that work. Saturday nights were the main event, but we had business 5 nights a week now, and Clara had hired a girl named Rosie Alderman, the bank president's daughter, which was its own satisfaction, to help with the floor 3 nights a week. The Fitch brothers came in now and then and behaved themselves, as men generally will once they understand the situation. The porch post I'd reset in October was solid. I'd painted the building, not the full building, just the front, in March, a gray-white, and someone in town had said it looked like a real establishment now. Clara had made a new sign. Not HARGROVE, she'd cut that down and used the wood for something else, but BRYCE and VEITCH, in plain black letters on a white board which she'd painted herself one afternoon while I was out. I came back and it was up over the door and she was standing on the porch looking at it. I stood beside her and looked at it. She said, is that all right? I said, it's more than all right. She said, your name first because you own the deed. I said, our name first because it's our place. She looked at me sidelong, said, our place. I said, our place. It was a Saturday in April, and the air had the first real warmth in it since October, that particular smell of thaw and new mud and something coming. She was standing at my left shoulder and she put her hand on my arm, not holding it, just there, the weight of her hand, and we stood there a minute, both of us looking at the sign. She said, you're a strange man, Harlan Bryce. I said, in what sense? She said, most men would have told me to leave when they found me behind that bar. I said, most men would have. She said, you didn't. I said, no. She said, why not? I thought about it, said, I don't think I had a reason exactly. I just looked at you and I could see you were capable and you were in a hard spot and you were more valuable standing up than hiding. Seemed wasteful to send you off. She said, wasteful. I said, that's not the whole of it. She said, I know it isn't. Her hand was still on my arm. She was looking at the sign, not at me, and her face had that expression she got sometimes, careful and open at the same time, which was its own particular thing, and which I'd learned to read as the expression that meant she was saying more than the words she was using. She said, I found a cot at the back of Oster's storage room. I told him I'd buy it off him for $2. I said, a cot? She said, for the front room. You've been sleeping on the floor since October. I said, I don't mind the floor. She said, I mind it for you. I looked at her. She was still looking at the sign. I said, Clara. She said, it's still not the time. I said, I know. She said, but it will be. I said, all right. The hand on my arm, the sign above the door. The street below with the mud of April in it, and somewhere further the sound of the river, which you could hear sometimes when the wind was from the east, low and steady and continuous, the sound of something that didn't stop for weather or for argument or for the plans of men. We went inside to open. That's the whole of it, really, or the whole of what I'll say here. The loan was paid off in full 14 months after we opened, which was right on Clara's projection. Alderman shook my hand again when I came in with the final payment and said Bryce and Veitch was the most reliably patronized establishment in Hargrove County. I said we appreciated the loan. He said anytime. I don't imagine we'll need another. Rosie Alderman works the floor 4 nights a week now, and we've taken on a second girl, Patience, who is new to the work but learns quickly and doesn't rattle when the room is loud. Sutter built us a proper back room off the kitchen last fall, a real room, walls and a door and a window. And he did it square and true, the way he does everything, and I paid him fairly and we had a drink together after, which is how things should go. Clara runs the bar. I run everything around the bar. That's how it was from the beginning and that's how it is now. Men who come in see us together and they understand quickly, without being told, that this is one operation and not two halves of an argument. And that steadiness, the visible steadiness of it, 2 people who know what they're doing and trust each other to do it, has been worth more than any amount of good whiskey in building what the place has become. It's June now. I'm sitting out on the porch in the morning the way I do, and the street has that particular early summer color, the dust not yet kicked up, the light clean and flat, a cat sitting on the boardwalk across the way, and a man going past with his hat in his hand. Clara came out a few minutes ago and set coffee down next to me without being asked, and then she put her hand on my shoulder for a moment, just a moment, weight and warmth, and went back inside. That's the thing, that's what I was trying to get to. I spent 30 years being useful to other men's operations. Competent, reliable, never a day of complaint, not because anyone noticed, but because that's how I was made, and a man goes on being what he is regardless of whether it's recognized. You get tired of that after a while. Not tired of the work, tired of the invisibility, tired of being the pair of hands that's used and thanked and forgotten. And then you win a saloon for $3 and you find a woman hiding behind the bar, and she watches you for 6 months with those careful eyes, and she runs numbers in a notebook, and she tells you the truth when you need to hear it, and she puts her hand on your shoulder in the morning without asking permission. She doesn't need me to be different than I am. She needs me to be exactly this, steady, capable, willing to stand at a door or in front of a freight brother without flinching. She chose this, freely, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. I've owned nothing my whole life. I've owned this building for 8 months, and I have the feeling, not a settled feeling, not a comfortable feeling, but a real one, that I'll own it until I die. That the name above the door is mine. That the woman who put it there chose to put my name on it. A man of 50 doesn't look for many things he didn't think he'd find, but sometimes things find him anyway. The coffee is hot and the morning is clear, and inside I can hear Clara moving around, getting ready for the day, the particular sound of her heels on the wood floor and the ring of a glass being set on the bar, ordinary as breathing. I'll finish the coffee, then I'll go in,